The morning of July 7, 2000, began like any other in Boise, Idaho. Sunlight warming the foothills, the faint hum of cicadas rising over quiet suburban streets. Mark Jensen stood by his red Ford Explorer, loading a small cooler and fishing rods, while his wife, Laura, secured their kids' backpacks in the back seat. 8-year-old Emma had her camera slung around her neck, snapping pictures of their golden retriever on the driveway. Tyler, just 6, begged to ride in the front. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip to Stanley Lake, 2 hours north, an escape from work, bills, and the constant rush of everyday life. But the Jensens never came back. When the family failed to return Sunday night, police began searching the winding mountain highways, the campsites, the small motels scattered along Route 55. Days turned into weeks, then months. Their car was never found. Neither were they. The story faded, like so many tragedies do, into whispers and rumors. If you're drawn to real stories that uncover truth after years of silence, the narrator's voice urges softly, make sure to subscribe, because this is one of those stories that never truly ended. 25 years later, Detective Eli Carter still remembers the call. He'd been a rookie back then, fresh badge, eager eyes. The Jensen disappearance was his first major case, and it haunted him ever since. Now, as autumn light settles over a changed Boise, Eli finds himself driving past the old police precinct, staring at the weathered photo of the missing family tacked to his dashboard. Their smiles, forever frozen in time, have never left him. He parks near the riverfront, where the city has built new cafes and walking paths. Life has moved on, but he hasn't. The Jensens became more than a case. They became the reason he joined the cold case division years later. Every unsolved file felt like a promise he hadn't kept. That morning, a message lands in his inbox. Subject line, "New evidence, Jensen case." It's from Rachel Porter, a journalist at the Idaho Statesman. Eli frowns, heart quickening. Rachel had covered the disappearance 2 decades ago, back when they were both just starting out. He clicks open the message. "Eli, you won't believe what turned up. Meet me tomorrow at the archives. We need to talk." He leans back, staring at the words. The last time he heard her name was in a documentary rerun, her voice narrating the same mystery he could never solve. What could she have possibly found now, after all these years? Outside, the sun dips behind the foothills. Eli exhales slowly, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles pale. Somewhere in his gut, something shifts, a mix of dread and relief. He'd buried this case for his own sanity, but if Rachel's message is real, if there's truly something new, maybe the story of the Jensens isn't over after all. He starts the engine, his reflection faint in the windshield, older, lined, but still driven by the same quiet obsession. Boise glows in the fading light as he pulls onto the road heading home. Tomorrow, the past would rise again. The next morning, Boise woke beneath a silver sky. Thin mist drifted from the river, softening the edges of downtown where new cafes and glass buildings stood beside the aging brick storefronts Eli remembered from years ago. He walked through the old district toward the archives building, a place that smelled of dust, ink, and time. Every step echoed with ghosts of questions left unanswered. Rachel Porter was waiting at the entrance, coffee in hand, her hair tied back, notebook already open. "You look exactly how I imagined," she said, offering a small smile that didn't hide her weariness. "And you," Eli replied, shaking her hand, "still chasing ghosts. Some of them don't let go." They entered the building together, their shoes clicking against polished floors. The archivist nodded in greeting as Rachel signed the log. Eli felt that old nervous energy rise again, the mix of hope and dread that came every time he faced this case. "I never thought I'd walk back in here for them," he murmured. Rachel glanced at him. "Boise's changed, but this story hasn't. People still talk about the Jensens. Every time a car goes missing, every time a family doesn't come home, it's like a shadow the town can't shake." Outside the wide windows, the city carried on. Food trucks lined the parkway, teenagers biked past the fountain, the hum of a new Boise replacing the quiet town it once was. But inside, the air felt frozen in 2000. Rachel flipped through an old binder, her voice softening. You know, I wrote the first article about them. The editor wanted a headline that would sell papers. I wanted one that would make people remember their faces. I still keep their picture on my desk." Eli nodded, tracing the edges of the file box marked Jensen Family Missing Persons. His throat tightened as the faded handwriting reminded him of his first supervisor's note. No further leads. Case inactive. "People had theories," Rachel said, sitting across from him. "Some swore they ran off because of debt. Others thought it was a bear attack or a freak accident in the mountains. Then there were the darker rumors." "Abduction," Eli muttered. "Or worse." Rachel's eyes flicked toward him. "You never believed they left by choice, did you?" He shook his head. Mark Jensen was meticulous. His car maintenance logs, insurance, even gas receipts. Everything pointed to a man who planned every detail. He wouldn't vanish into thin air. Silence lingered for a moment, broken only by the rustle of pages. "I've seen families disappear in my line of work," Eli continued quietly. "But something about this one, it's like the trail was meant to go cold." Rachel leaned forward, curiosity sharp in her gaze. "Then maybe it's time we warm it up again." Eli looked out at the city he'd known all his life. The skyline had grown, but the same mountains stood distant and unmoved, as if guarding their secrets. "All right," he said finally, voice low but certain. "Let's find out what really happened to the Jensens." Rachel smiled faintly. "Welcome back to the shadows." Dust rose in faint spirals as Eli slid the cardboard box across the archive table. The label, Jensen Case 2000, was barely legible. 25 years of neglect had turned the ink gray, the tape brittle. Rachel adjusted her glasses and opened her notebook, anticipation flickering in her eyes. "I still can't believe this box hasn't been digitized," she said. "Some cases get buried deeper than others," Eli replied quietly. He lifted the lid, revealing files, photographs, and bagged items sealed with evidence tape so old it was peeling. Rachel leaned closer. "What exactly are we looking for?" "Anything that doesn't make sense," Eli said, pulling out a stack of police reports. "Something everyone missed." The first folder contained photos of the family. Mark and Laura Jensen smiling beside their SUV, the kids on the porch with melting ice cream cones. Rachel stared at the images, her voice barely a whisper. "They look so alive." "It's strange to think all this just stopped." Eli nodded but kept flipping pages. He found the last recorded sighting, dated July 7th, 2000, at a motel near Horseshoe Bend. "This is it," he murmured. "They checked in here, but there's no record of checkout." Rachel frowned. "No credit card trail?" "None. The report says they paid cash." He reached for another envelope marked Miscellaneous Evidence. Inside lay a faded road map of Idaho with a red pen circle around a rest stop north of the city. Eli unfolded it carefully, tracing the mark with his thumb. "Did anyone ever search this spot?" he asked. Rachel shook her head. "If they did, it's not in the files." At the bottom of the box, she noticed a small canister of undeveloped film sealed inside an evidence bag. "What about this?" Eli's brow furrowed. "That's from the Jensen family's camera. It was found in their house after the disappearance, supposedly blank." "Supposedly?" "They said the negatives were too damaged to process." He paused, his mind racing. "But technology's changed since 2000. Maybe we can recover something." Rachel scribbled notes rapidly. "Let's get it developed." "I know a lab downtown that handles old rolls." Eli exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "After all this time, you think there's still something left to find?" Rachel met his eyes. "I think some stories don't stay buried just because we stop looking." He stared at the scattered evidence across the table, the map, the photos, the film roll, like fragments of a puzzle missing its final piece. He felt a pulse of determination, the same stubborn fire that once drove him as a rookie. "I'm not reopening the case officially," he warned. "Not yet." "I'm not asking for official," Rachel replied. "Just honest." Eli gave a faint smile, one corner of his mouth lifting. "All right then. Tomorrow morning we start here." He tapped the map, his finger resting on the red circle. "This rest stop." "The one everyone forgot." Rachel closed her notebook slowly. Funny how the smallest mark can change everything. Eli nodded, his voice barely above a murmur. If it leads somewhere, it might change more than that. The next morning brought a grey drizzle over Boise, soft enough to blur the mountains on the horizon. Eli and Rachel drove north along Route 55, past damp pine trees and fog curling above the river. The map from the evidence box lay folded on the dashboard, the motel circled in fading red ink. 25 years had passed, yet the road looked nearly the same. Old signs, cracked asphalt, the same curve bending toward Horseshoe Bend. They pulled into what was once the Pine Creek Motel, a narrow row of cabins now half boarded up, its sign leaning against rusted poles. Eli's breath fogged the air as he stepped out, the smell of rain and cedar thick around them. Inside the office, a small bell tinkled when Rachel pushed the door. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman in a floral sweater sorting through letters. She looked up with polite confusion. "Mrs. Madsen?" Eli asked. "Yes," she said, voice thin but steady. "Can I help you?" He showed his badge. "Detective Carter, Boise PD, retired now. This is Rachel Porter, journalist with the Idaho Statesman. We're revisiting an old case. The Jensen family stayed here in July 2000. Her eyes flickered with recognition. "Good Lord," she whispered, setting the letters aside. "I remember them." Rachel leaned forward. "You do?" Mrs. Madsen nodded slowly. "Nice family. 2 kids. The little girl asked for extra towels for her camera bath, whatever that meant." A faint smile crossed her face, then faded. "They stayed in cabin 3. Only one night." Eli exchanged a glance with Rachel. "Do you recall anything unusual that night?" The woman hesitated, rubbing her palms together. "There was an argument outside. The father, Mark, was it? He was talking to a man near the parking lot. I remember because the stranger wasn't a guest. He drove a green pickup, looked like a construction worker. Rough hands, maybe mid-40s. Eli's voice sharpened slightly. "Did you catch what they were arguing about?" "No, just saw them from the window." The man gestured sharply, then left in a hurry. The family checked out early the next morning. Rachel jotted the details down. "Do you remember anything else about the truck? A license plate, maybe?" Mrs. Madsen shook her head. "Only that it had Idaho plates and a dent on the rear bumper. I told the police back then, but they said it probably didn't matter." Eli felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "They dismissed it." "They did. Said there was no record of anyone by that description." Rain ticked softly against the windows. Eli looked at the faded guest ledger on the counter, each name handwritten in looping cursive. He asked gently, "Do you still have records from that summer?" "I keep everything," she said, disappearing into a back room. When she returned, she handed him an old binder wrapped in plastic. "I don't know if it'll help, but it's all there." Eli accepted it carefully, the weight of old paper grounding him. "You've helped more than you know," he said. As they stepped back into the drizzle, Rachel glanced at him. "A man in a green pickup. Think it's something?" Eli's jaw tightened. "It's something the reports forgot." The following day dawned brighter, the sky brushed with streaks of pale gold over the mountains. Eli and Rachel left Boise early, following the same winding route the Jensen family had taken 25 years earlier. The landscape unfolded like an old photograph, rolling fields, pine forests, and the river flashing silver beside the road. For hours they drove in silence, each lost in thought. "Do you ever think about what they were feeling that day?" Rachel asked quietly. "Packing up, expecting nothing more than a weekend away?" Eli nodded. "I think about it all the time. Ordinary moments right before everything goes wrong, that's the part that stays with you." As they neared the Sawtooth Range, the air grew cooler. They stopped at a roadside diner marked Rusty Elk Cafe, its neon sign flickering faintly. Eli remembered reading about it in the original report. It was one of the last known stops along the Jensen route. The place hadn't changed much. Wooden booths, faded photos of fishermen, and the smell of bacon and coffee lingering in the air. A woman in her 70s approached their table with practiced warmth. Her name tag read, "Nora." "Haven't seen you two around here before," she said, pouring coffee. Rachel smiled politely. We're looking into an old case, the Jensen family, July 2000. You were probably working here then. Nora froze, the coffee pot trembling slightly in her hand. The Jensens, she murmured. Yes, I remember them. 2 kids, sweet little things. The boy spilled orange juice, and the father apologized like it was the end of the world. Eli leaned forward. Do you recall anything unusual? Anyone else paying attention to them? She frowned, trying to summon the past. There was a man, sat alone in the corner booth by the window. Didn't eat much, just kept watching them. Green pickup parked outside. I thought maybe he was a friend waiting to join them, but he left a few minutes after they did. Rachel and Eli exchanged a glance. Can you describe him? Eli asked. Middle-aged, rough clothes, construction boots, dark hair. Not someone you forget easily, but I never saw him again. Nora sighed and looked down. That family's faces stayed with me. The little girl took a picture of me with her camera before they left. Eli felt a chill crawl through him. A picture? Nora nodded. She said she liked my necklace, told me she was collecting photos of happy people. Sweet kid. Rachel scribbled quickly in her notebook. That could be on the undeveloped film. Eli's mind raced. If that roll captured the diner, maybe the man was in the background. It could be the first real lead in decades. He thanked Nora, leaving a generous tip before they stepped back outside. The air had turned crisp, the scent of pine thick and sharp. Behind them, the neon sign buzzed faintly, casting orange light over the asphalt. Rachel looked down the empty road stretching toward the mountains. He was following them, she said softly. Eli stared into the distance, where the forest seemed to swallow the highway whole. Then it's time we find out how far he went. Back in Boise, the sky hung low and grey as Eli parked outside a modest single-story house in the North End. The address belonged to Karen Hale, Laura Jensen's younger sister. Over the years, she'd been the one constant voice demanding answers, writing letters to the police, calling local reporters, refusing to let the story die. When she opened the door, time showed in the faint lines around her eyes, but her posture remained firm. "Detective Carter," she said, recognizing him instantly. "I wondered when you'd finally knock again." Eli removed his cap. "It's been too long, Karen." Rachel stood beside him, offering a gentle nod. "We're hoping to revisit some details from the case, if you're willing." Karen hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in, but I've told this story more times than I can count." The living room smelled faintly of pine and old paper. On the mantel sat framed photos of Laura, Mark, and the kids, smiling at a 4th of July barbecue. The colors were faded, but the warmth remained. Karen gestured toward the couch. "I kept everything," she said, pulling a large plastic bin from beneath the coffee table. Letters, drawings, even Emma's old school projects. I thought if anyone ever cared enough to look again, these might mean something. Eli crouched beside the bin and began lifting out small treasures, postcards, handmade cards, and finally a bundle of crayon drawings tied with string. One drawing caught his eye, a stick-figure family beside a red SUV, mountains in the background, and beside them a tall man with a square green shape behind him, clearly a truck. Rachel leaned closer. "Is that?" Karen nodded solemnly. "Emma drew that the week before they left. Laura told me she'd been talking about a man who came by their house once. Said he was asking about the car. Claimed to be from a nearby repair shop. Laura didn't think much of it." Eli studied the sketch, his pulse quickening. "Did the police ever see this?" "I tried," Karen said bitterly. "They said it was just a child's imagination, but I never believed that." Mark was careful, too careful for something random to happen. The bitterness in her tone softened as she sat down, looking at the family photo on the wall. "You know, people stopped calling after a while. They said I needed to move on. But how do you move on when no one's found them?" Eli lowered his voice. "You don't. You just learn to wait differently." Karen looked at him with quiet understanding. "You still think about them too, don't you?" He met her gaze. "Every single day." For a long moment, The house was silent, except for the ticking of a small clock. Then Rachel closed her notebook carefully. "Karen, your memory might help more than you realize. We're following a lead about a man with a green pickup. This drawing, it's not proof yet, but it's something real." Karen gave a faint, hopeful smile. "Then promise me one thing," she said softly. "If you find out what happened, don't let them just become another story." Eli's voice steadied. "I promise." The rain had stopped by the time Rachel called Eli that evening. Her voice carried a rush of energy he hadn't heard in years. "Eli, I think I found something. You'd better come see this." An hour later, they met outside a fenced storage yard on the outskirts of Nampa. The place smelled of rust and gasoline, rows of forgotten vehicles stretching into the dim light. A guard waved them through after a quick check of Rachel's press credentials. Eli followed her down a narrow path between cars, puddles reflecting the dull glow of overhead lamps. "You want to tell me what I'm looking at?" he asked. Rachel stopped beside a tarp-covered truck, its once green paint faded to moss gray. "This," she said quietly, "was impounded in 2000, found abandoned near Cascade Road. The paperwork says the owner never came back for it." Eli stared at the vehicle, the color unmistakable even beneath layers of dust. His pulse picked up. "Green pickup," he muttered. Rachel nodded. "Plates match Idaho registration from that year. I cross-checked with the DMV. Guess what? The file's missing." He frowned. "Convenient." She handed him a clipboard with the old impound tag attached. "It was towed 2 weeks after the Jensens disappeared. Nobody connected it because the registration transfer was incomplete. It just sat here. Forgotten." Eli circled the truck slowly, the crunch of gravel under his boots echoing in the silence. The driver's door handle was rusted, but the window had been repaired with duct tape long ago. He peered through the glass. Inside lay tattered seat covers, old tools, and something glinting faintly beneath the driver's seat. "Rachel, get the flashlight," he said. The beam cut through the gloom. Eli reached inside carefully with gloved hands, pulling out a small metal keychain, its charm shaped like a yellow sun with a smiley face. The plastic was cracked, but the engraving on the back was still visible. "Property of Emma Jensen." Rachel's breath caught. "Oh, my God." Eli stared at it, feeling the air thicken around him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, he slipped the keychain into an evidence bag. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Rachel glanced toward the truck bed, where a fragment of carpet peeked through the dust. "Should we call it in?" Eli hesitated. "Not yet. If this gets out too soon, it'll turn into a circus. We need to confirm what we're seeing before anyone else touches it." He crouched, running his fingers along the frame. "I'll take samples for testing." "Fibers, prints, whatever's left." Rachel watched him, her expression a mix of awe and unease. "Eli, if this really belonged to whoever followed them, then we're standing in the middle of the biggest mistake the department ever made," he finished. Thunder rumbled distantly, low and heavy. The two stood beside the forgotten truck, the wind carrying the smell of rain and old metal. Eli sealed the evidence bag and straightened up. "After 25 years, he said, voice steady but cold, "the Jensens just spoke again." 2 days later, the lab results came back. Eli sat in his office, the sound of rain tapping against the window, the report trembling slightly in his hands. Under the heading Trace Evidence Analysis, one line stood out in bold: "Human hair, DNA match to Emma Jensen." For a long moment he couldn't breathe. It was confirmation, but it felt like heartbreak. Rachel stood across from him, eyes wide. "So it's real," she whispered. "It's real," Eli said hoarsely. "That truck was part of it." Rachel sank into the chair opposite him. "Who owned it?" Eli flipped through the documents he'd requested from the DMV. "Frank Miller, construction worker, lived in Garden City back in 2000. "Miller," she repeated, as if tasting the name. "Was he ever questioned?" Eli scanned the old police notes, brow tightening. "Once. He claimed he saw the family at the motel but didn't know them personally. He moved away right after the disappearance. Case file says lack of evidence, no charges filed." Rachel frowned. And no one followed up when he left the state. He shook his head. Back then, we didn't have interstate coordination like we do now. If someone packed up and vanished, it was easy to disappear. Rachel stood, pacing slowly. So for 25 years, his truck sat collecting dust while everyone thought the Jensens had just vanished. Eli leaned back, exhaustion sinking into his bones. We searched mountains, rivers, miles of forest, but the answer was sitting in a scrapyard an hour from home. The office grew quiet, filled only by the hum of rain. Rachel broke the silence first. "Do you still have contacts in Garden City?" "Maybe one or two," Eli replied. "I'll start there. If Miller's still alive, someone's bound to know where he went." Rachel crossed her arms, her voice low but determined. "We can't let this slip through the cracks again. If he's out there, he's been living free while that family's faces have been on flyers and memorial walls." Eli nodded, feeling a dull anger rise in him, the same frustration that had haunted him for decades. No more forgetting. He turned back to his computer, pulling up old personnel rosters, property records, anything that might trace Miller's trail. One name appeared again and again: Boise Construction Co., a small firm that had shut down in 2001. He jotted the address on a pad, eyes narrowing. Rachel glanced over his shoulder. "Think someone there might remember him." "Someone always remembers," Eli said quietly. "The trick is getting them to talk." He closed the report and looked out the rain-streaked window. Boise's skyline shimmered faintly in the distance, the same city he'd sworn to protect but couldn't save from forgetting. "This isn't just a lead," he said finally. "It's a second chance." Rachel met his gaze, determination reflecting his own. "Then let's take it." Eli gathered the files, the photo of the green pickup now clipped to the top. The name Frank Miller stared back at him in neat black print, ordinary, forgettable, and suddenly carrying the weight of everything he'd been searching for. The news broke faster than Eli expected. By the next morning, every major outlet in Idaho had picked up the story. New evidence links Jensen cold case to local man. The phone at his office rang non-stop, messages from reporters, old colleagues, even strangers offering theories, but Eli didn't answer any of them. He sat at his desk staring at the article Rachel had written, careful, factual, but undeniably powerful. The headline alone carried 25 years of grief. Outside, Boise buzzed with renewed energy. People talked about the Jensens in grocery lines, coffee shops, and radio shows. A case that had faded into legend was alive again. Yet with every conversation, Eli felt the same old ache pressing deeper into his chest. Rachel entered the office, holding 2 coffees. "You've officially gone viral," she said lightly, placing 1 cup beside him. "Not sure that's a good thing," he muttered. "People needed to remember," she replied. "It's not gossip, it's accountability." He looked up, his tired eyes softening. "You know what accountability feels like after 25 years. It feels like failure dressed as closure." Rachel sat across from him. "You were one of the few who didn't give up. That has to count for something." Eli didn't respond. The words hit, but they didn't heal. Instead, he glanced at the photo pinned to the wall, the Jensens smiling in front of their house, the kids holding a puppy. "I keep wondering what would have happened if I'd looked harder, if I'd gone back to that motel, checked the files myself. Maybe they wouldn't have stayed missing for so long." "Stop," Rachel said quietly. "You can't rewrite the past." He let out a dry laugh. "The past seems to be rewriting itself just fine without me." A knock interrupted them. It was Captain Morales, Eli's former superior, and now head of the cold case division. "Carter," he said gruffly, stepping inside. "You've stirred up quite the storm." "Wasn't intentional," Eli replied. Morales crossed his arms. "The department's under pressure. The mayor wants an update. The media's camping outside the precinct, and victims' families are calling non-stop. You realize what this means, right?" Eli nodded slowly. "It means the Jensens finally matter again." Morales sighed. "It also means eyes are on us. Every mistake from that investigation will come back up. People want someone to blame." Rachel glanced at Eli, sensing the weight behind the captain's warning. "So what happens now?" Morales hesitated, then said, "You two keep it quiet from here on out. No leaks, no speculation. We'll reopen the case formally, but I can't promise the department will like you digging through old skeletons." After he left, Rachel leaned back in her chair. "He's worried about headlines. You're worried about ghosts. And I'm just worried we're running out of time." Eli rubbed his temples, exhaustion pulling at him. "The Jensens deserve truth, not politics." Rachel's eyes softened. "Then let's make sure they get it." Outside, thunder rumbled again, soft, distant, but promising a storm. Eli looked through the window at the city he loved, now alive with the weight of memory. "The truth's coming," he murmured, "whether anyone's ready or not." The days dragged on, heavy with anticipation. Eli and Rachel spent hours tracking down anyone who might still remember Frank Miller, the man whose name had resurfaced like a ghost. Each call seemed to lead to a dead end, but they kept pushing. With every scrap of new information, the case felt closer to breaking wide open. Finally, Eli hit a lead. An old co-worker of Frank Miller's, someone who had worked with him at a construction site near Garden City, had seen him just a few months before he disappeared. Eli and Rachel made the drive out to the site, a quiet stretch of land now occupied by a new shopping mall. The air smelled of fresh concrete and cut grass, a stark contrast to the story they were chasing. They met with Miller's former colleague, a man named Dennis Green, at a small cafe near the site. Dennis was mid-50s, weathered but sharp. His hands shook as he handed over a coffee cup. He hadn't spoken to Miller since 2001, but there was something in his eyes when he recognized the name. "Here, I remember Frank," Dennis said slowly, looking over his shoulder as though checking if anyone was listening. "Quiet guy, worked hard, never talked much about his personal life. But there was one thing. He was obsessed with the Jensens." Rachel leaned forward. "Obsessed? What do you mean?" Dennis glanced around again, lowering his voice. "Well, Frank would show up at work talking about them all the time, about how perfect they looked, like they had this perfect little life. He'd talk about how he wanted to be part of it." He paused, swallowing hard. "I think he was fixated on the wife, Laura." Eli felt his stomach twist. "Fixated?" Dennis nodded. "Yeah, but here's the thing. He wasn't all there. He'd go on these long rants about how they didn't appreciate what they had, like it wasn't enough for him. I told him once to knock it off, but it didn't do much." Rachel exchanged a look with Eli. "Did he ever do anything strange? Follow them, maybe?" Dennis hesitated. "I don't know. I told you he kept to himself, but—" His voice trailed off, and he rubbed his temple. "There was this one time, late one night, Frank came to the job site with this weird look in his eyes. I asked him if everything was okay. He said, 'I'm going to make sure they get what they deserve.'" The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Eli and Rachel stared at each other, the weight of what Dennis had just shared sinking in. "What happened after that?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dennis shook his head. "That was the last time I saw him. He vanished after that, but I always thought he'd done something to them, something bad." Rachel's voice was tight as she asked, "Did you tell the police?" Dennis shook his head again. "No, I didn't know what to think." "He was gone and they just disappeared." The silence between them deepened. Eli's mind raced, connecting the dots. Frank Miller's obsession with the Jensens, his strange comment, the truck in the scrapyard, it all pointed to one conclusion. "I'm going to find him," Eli said finally, standing up. "He's still out there, I know it." Dennis watched him, his eyes dark. "Be careful. Some people don't want to be found." Outside, the sky had turned an angry shade of grey, thunder rumbling in the distance. The storm felt like a warning. As Eli and Rachel walked back to the car, the air seemed to grow heavier with every step. They were closer to the truth, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. It had been 3 weeks since Eli and Rachel had interviewed Dennis Green. The search for Frank Miller had turned into something far more complex and dangerous than they ever imagined. Every lead seemed to dead end, and the pressure from the media and the community was mounting. With each passing day, Eli felt the weight of the Jensens case pressing down on him. It wasn't just about finding Frank Miller anymore. It was about bringing closure to a family that had been lost for too long. The phone call came just as Eli was about to leave for the day. "Carter," the voice on the other end said, sharp and urgent. "We've got him." Eli's heart skipped a beat. "Miller?" "Yeah, he's in custody." "And you won't believe where we found him." Rachel met him outside the precinct, just as the news was breaking. A federal agent had tracked Frank Miller to a small, rundown cabin just outside Missoula, Montana. He'd been living under an assumed name for years, Tom Reynolds, working construction jobs off the books, keeping to himself. "He never went far," Eli muttered, the realization settling in. But he didn't expect us to get this close. They drove to the holding facility in Missoula, where Frank Miller was waiting. The closer they got, the more palpable the tension became. Rachel kept glancing at Eli, her face tight with both anticipation and dread. They both knew the weight of this moment. This was the point where it all could collapse, where the truth might be too much for either of them to bear. Inside the facility, Frank Miller was seated in a small interrogation room, handcuffed to the table. He looked older than the man they'd seen in the photo, his hair graying, his face lined with bitterness and fatigue. But his eyes, those eyes, hadn't changed. They were still cold, calculating. Eli stepped forward, his badge heavy on his chest. "Frank Miller," he said, his voice steady but edged with a quiet fury. "You've been running for a long time." Miller didn't speak. He just stared at Eli, his gaze almost daring him to speak first. Rachel took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Why, Frank?" "Why the Jensens?" Miller's lips twitched, but he didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes. Eli slammed his hand against the table, his patience thin. "You followed them. You watched them. What happened to that family, Frank? What happened to Mark, Laura, Emma, and Tyler?" Miller's eyes flickered briefly, but he still said nothing. The room seemed to close in on them, the air thick with the weight of the unsaid words. Rachel leaned in, her voice low but intense. "You hurt them, didn't you? You didn't just follow them, you took them, and you thought you'd get away with it, but you didn't." Miller's hands shook as he finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. They didn't understand. She didn't understand. I wanted what they had. But they didn't see me." Eli took a step back, disgust washing over him. "You didn't want them, Frank. You wanted to destroy them. And now, it's over." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Finally, Miller spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I just wanted to be close to her. To have what they had." The room felt colder. Eli's heart clenched as he realized the true horror of what had happened. It wasn't just an obsession, it was a twisted desire, fueled by something deeper and darker than he could have ever imagined. Rachel's eyes were filled with both pity and anger. "You've made us all wait long enough, Frank. The Jensens deserved more than your silence." Frank Miller's arrest was the first step toward justice, but it came with a cost. The truth finally was too much to bear. The case had been solved, but it left scars that would never heal. The confession came like a crack in the dam, small at first, but then pouring out uncontrollably. Eli sat across from Frank Miller in the dim, cold interrogation room, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing like an irritating fly. Frank had been silent for hours after his initial outburst, but now, in the dark, his voice broke, barely a whisper. "They didn't understand," Miller mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Not at first, not when I started watching them. She was so perfect. Laura, I thought if I just followed them, maybe they'd let me in. Maybe she'd see me, see what I wanted to give her." Eli's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain still, to not react. "You wanted to give her something. You stalked her. You obsessed over her. How is that giving her anything?" Frank's head lowered, his hands trembling as they gripped the edges of the table. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he whispered. "I never meant for it to go that far, but she was everything I needed, and Mark, he wasn't good enough for her. He didn't know what he had. I thought if I just—" He trailed off, his eyes blank as though lost in the past. Rachel, standing in the corner of the room, exchanged a glance with Eli. Her expression was a mixture of disbelief and disgust, but there was also a sense of cold, hard determination. "What did you do to them, Frank?" she asked, her voice soft but sharp with the edge of years of unanswered questions. Frank looked up slowly, as if waking from a daze. "I followed them to the motel. They were leaving for Stanley Lake. I'd been there before, pretending to be a good Samaritan, fixing things on their car, checking their tires. She didn't know who I was, but I thought maybe I could get her to notice me. Maybe I could fix things between us." His voice cracked as he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "But when they left, I followed them. I wanted to be close to her. I just wanted to be with her. And when they stopped at that diner, they were so happy. I couldn't stand it. I thought, this is the life I could have if she just—" He stopped, his body shaking, as if the very memory was torturing him. Eli leaned in, his voice cold, cutting through the air. "What did you do, Frank? Tell me what happened to them." Miller's eyes glazed over, his breath quickening. I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't mean to hurt them. But when they left, I followed them into the mountains. I couldn't stop. I thought if I could just be there, if I could just force my way in, it would all be okay. But when I finally caught up to them, it was— I don't even know what happened. It just went wrong. They fought back and— Frank's voice faltered, the words turning to unintelligible murmurs. The truth, when it came, was like poison, the horror and guilt leaking out in fits and starts. He couldn't seem to say the rest, as if he was afraid to speak the final truth. Eli took a step forward, his voice steady but unwavering. "You took them from their family. You took them from their friends. And you thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Frank nodded, his face contorted in shame and something darker, remorse or self-loathing. It wasn't clear. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen," Frank said, his voice breaking now. "I just wanted to be close to her, but now it's too late." The room was suffocating, the walls closing in on them. Rachel stood, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She finally spoke, her voice full of an icy resolve. "You took their lives, Frank, and now you'll answer for it." As the confession hung in the air, the weight of it settled over them like a blanket of suffocating darkness. The case was no longer about finding missing persons. It was about something far more twisted, a life destroyed, a family erased, and the unbearable truth of obsession gone horribly wrong. The trial of Frank Miller began months after his confession, but the town of Boise had already changed. The Jensen story was no longer just a mystery. It had become a tragedy that brought the entire community together, a story of loss, but also a story of truth finally coming to light. The local news stations carried updates daily, and the headlines spoke of justice, but there was something quieter that no one could escape. The pain was still there. Eli stood at the memorial service for the Jensens in the town's central park, the same place where families gathered every summer for picnics. The green grass now felt empty, the trees looming like silent witnesses to the tragedy that had unfolded. It was a bright day, but there was no joy in it, only solemnity, like the world itself was holding its breath. Karen Hale, Laura Jensen's sister, stood beside Eli, her hands trembling as she held a framed photograph of her family. It was one of those perfect snapshots that you see in albums, before tragedy strikes. Mark with his arm around Laura, Emma and Tyler laughing, their smiles wide and genuine. The kind of picture you look at and think, this was before everything changed. Eli spoke quietly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "I still can't believe they're gone." Karen nodded, her eyes fixed on the photo. "They were just so normal, you know? Just a family. It's not supposed to happen like this. People don't disappear, not like that." The crowd gathered around them, some familiar faces, some strangers. Neighbors, friends, people who had lived beside the Jensens but never knew how much their absence would tear the fabric of their small town. Karen had invited them all to this moment, so they could grieve together, so they could remember. "I've kept their things," Karen continued, her voice breaking for just a moment. "The little things that they left behind. The kids' drawings, their clothes. "It's all I have now." She looked up at Eli, her eyes full of both gratitude and sorrow. "You gave me this. You gave me the chance to say goodbye." Eli looked at her, his heart heavy. "I didn't do it alone." Karen's gaze softened. "I know, but you were the one who didn't give up. You were the one who wouldn't let them be forgotten." Rachel stood a few paces away, taking notes for her article, but her eyes kept drifting to the photo that Karen held. Eli could see that she too had been affected by the story. It had consumed them both. But for Rachel there was still a sense of duty, a need to tell this story the right way, to honor the lives that had been lost. The ceremony continued, with speeches from local leaders and some of the families who had been close to the Jensens. A few survivors from the missing families' past shared their memories, speaking of days long gone, of birthdays, holiday dinners, and summers spent fishing at Stanley Lake. They spoke of the Jensens as if they were still there, as if their spirits lingered in the corners of the room. As the service ended, Eli stood in silence, watching Karen place the framed photo next to a bouquet of wildflowers. The Jensens would never be truly forgotten. Their faces would remain in the hearts of those who loved them. But the burden of their loss was something that could never be erased. Karen turned to Eli, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up." "For bringing them home." Eli nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not enough, but it's something." The weight of their shared grief settled between them, heavy and unspoken. The Jensens were home, but the road to healing was just beginning. Weeks after Frank Miller's arrest, the town of Boise seemed to settle into a quiet that had been missing for years. The headlines slowly faded, and the community began to adjust, though the echoes of the Jensen story lingered in the air like a shadow. For Eli, it was both a relief and a burden. Justice had been served, but something inside him felt unresolved, as if the conclusion of the case had not yet freed him. He visited the local diner that morning, an old place he'd passed 1,000 times but never stopped to enter. The familiar scent of coffee filled the air, and the low murmur of conversation was comforting in a way. It was a cold day, the sky a grey sheet above, and Eli found a seat near the window, his thoughts heavy as he gazed out at the streets he had walked for years. Rachel slid into the booth across from him, her notepad in hand. She didn't speak at first, allowing the silence to stretch between them, the kind of silence that spoke volumes after everything they had been through. "I never thought it would end this way," Eli finally said, his voice quiet almost to himself. Rachel nodded, setting her pen down. "Justice isn't always what we expect, is it?" "No," Eli replied, shaking his head slowly, "but it's what they deserve." She took a deep breath and looked at him, her expression softer than usual. "I've been thinking about how this case has changed us. We weren't just solving a mystery. We were chasing ghosts, running after a past that didn't want to be found." Eli looked out the window again, his eyes tracing the contours of the city. "Yeah. And the more we dug, the more it felt like we were unearthing something that was never supposed to be uncovered." Rachel leaned back, her eyes thoughtful. "I don't think anyone will ever forget the Jensens. But maybe the most important thing is that, for the first time in 25 years, their story was told. And not just the story of their disappearance, but the truth of who they were." Eli's mind drifted back to the memorial service, to Karen holding that picture of her sister's family, to the faces of the people who had known the Jensens, remembered them as they had been before everything changed. He thought of the small town they had called home, and how despite the horror of their disappearance, they had become a symbol of resilience. "You think we'll ever be able to move on from this?" Eli asked, his voice carrying the weight of years. Rachel paused, taking a long sip from her coffee before answering. "Maybe we don't have to. Maybe moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It just means accepting that some things, like the Jensens, will stay with us. Forever." Eli exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly, as if a weight had been lifted. "You're right. Maybe it's time I let it go." She smiled gently. "It's hard. But sometimes letting go is the only way we can really move forward." The waitress came by, refilling their cups. As she walked away, Rachel slid the notepad across the table, showing Eli the opening lines of her latest article. The Jensens. A family lost, a town changed. The case that defined a community. Eli smiled faintly. It's a good headline. Rachel smiled back, her eyes meeting his. It's the truth. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, drifting down softly, as if the world itself was offering a quiet moment of peace after the storm. Eli looked out at the city, feeling the weight of the past finally easing. It wasn't over, but it was a new beginning for the Jensens, for the town, and for him. The months after Frank Miller's trial passed slowly. The town of Boise had adjusted to its new reality, one where the Jensens' story was no longer a haunting mystery, but a painful truth. People went back to their routines, but there was an underlying shift in the air, a shared awareness that something had changed forever. The echoes of what happened would resonate long after the case was closed. Eli stood on the edge of Stanley Lake, the same spot where the Jensens had planned their trip 25 years ago. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, their peaks shrouded in early morning mist. The air was crisp, clean, with a quiet that was almost sacred. It felt like the kind of place where answers could be found, yet still there was a sense that some questions would never have perfect answers. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves behind him. Rachel walked up beside him, the two of them standing in silence for a long time. The sun had just risen, casting a warm golden hue over the lake. "It's beautiful here," Rachel said softly, looking out across the water. "I can see why they loved it." Eli nodded, his gaze fixed on the water's surface. It was supposed to be their escape, a weekend away. "And they never came back," Rachel finished for him, her voice quiet, filled with sorrow. Eli turned to her. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about remembering them, their lives, their story. Not just the tragedy, but who they were before it all happened. Rachel looked at him, her eyes thoughtful. "Do you think the town will ever fully heal?" Eli paused, thinking about the town he had grown up in, the place that had felt so familiar and safe until the Jensens vanished. The community had come together to mourn, but they had also learned to face the darkness that had once been hidden. "It's hard to say," Eli said finally, "but I think remembering, really remembering, is the first step. Maybe that's all we can do. Honor their lives, their memories, and the truth of what happened." Rachel nodded, taking out her notepad. She had been writing an article, reflecting on how the case had changed everything. The truth, no matter how ugly, had brought the Jensens home in the only way it could. "There will always be ghosts, Eli," Rachel said, her voice almost a whisper. "But the real tragedy is when we forget them. When we stop telling their stories." Eli smiled faintly, his thoughts drifting back to the moment when the Jensens had been found. "We won't forget them. Not while I'm still here." The silence stretched between them once again, the sound of the water gently lapping against the shore filling the space. The sky overhead had turned to a soft pale blue, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the clouds. "It's strange," Rachel said after a while, "how life moves on, even when we don't feel ready for it." Eli glanced over at her. "Maybe that's the point. Life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It just keeps moving forward." She smiled softly. "I guess it's time for us to do the same." Eli turned back to the lake, taking in the beauty of the moment. It was peaceful now, the storm that had once raged through their lives slowly fading into memory. But the truth remained, like the steady pulse of the earth beneath his feet. As he exhaled slowly, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long while, Eli knew that justice had been served, and the Jensen story, their truth, would echo through time, not as a mystery, but as a lesson in remembering, in seeking the truth, no matter how long it took. He looked at the horizon. It was the beginning of a new day. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of a new chapter for him too.